A great danger awaited the pilots and passengers on board a Boeing 747, one of the largest passenger planes in the world. Flight 6, a giant jetliner with 179 people on board, was moving towards the runway in a storm and heavy rain. What they were about to experience was one of the rarest events in aviation history. The story of Flight 6 is based on official accident reports and eyewitness accounts. October 31, 2000. Chiang Kai-shek International Airport is the busiest and largest airport in Taiwan. The airport has been renamed over the years and is now known as Taoyuan Airport. On the night of Halloween, this Boeing 747-400 of Singapore Airlines was on its way from Singapore to Taiwan. Singapore Airlines is known as one of the best airlines in the world. The intermediate stop on their flight route was Taiwan Chiang Kai-shek Airport, where they are now located. If we talk a little bit about the airplane, this Boeing 747 was delivered to Singapore Airlines in January 1997. It was the 1099th Boeing 747 built in history. The unit cost was $267 million. This double-deck 4-engine jet had a capacity of 624 passengers. It was a brand new airplane, only 3 years old, and equipped with new technologies. In the captain's seat was the 41-year-old Captain Foon, who had more than 11,000 hours of flight experience. The captain also had more than 2,000 hours of flight experience in this type of airplane. In short, he was a pilot with a good command of the airplane. In the right seat was 36-year-old co-pilot Latif. He also had more than 2,400 flight experience. Also on board was a third pilot, 38-year-old NG with 5,500 flight hours. The third pilot NG was there to take over the controls from the captain over the ocean and to let the captain rest. All 3 pilots in the cockpit were well rested and prepared for the flight. 179 people boarded the plane, including 159 passengers and 20 flight crew. The majority of the passengers were US citizens. The pilots made their final checks and started pushback from Gate Bravo 5 for the 12-hour journey. The weather was thunderous and torrential due to the typhoon in the region at the time. There were also strong winds and interesting cloud formations in the region. The captain turned to his co-pilot and said that they would taxi very slowly and there was a possibility of skidding. The co-pilot turned to the captain and said that they understood and that their speed was 9 knots. The tower contacted the aircraft and said that the wind is coming from 20 degrees at 24 knots and the headwind is 43 knots. This means that it can blow at 80 kilometers per hour. Looking at the wind readings given, it was indeed quite strong at the airport, and even worse, it was seen that the wind could suddenly increase up to 80 kilometers per hour. When the pilots saw the wind values, which were almost within the limits, they realized that they had to take off as soon as possible, otherwise, the weather would get much worse. The pilots' decision to take off as soon as possible was one of the main reasons for the upcoming situation because pilots under time pressure are more prone to make mistakes. The captain told his co-pilot to inform him when the winds reached 30 knots. The co-pilot responded that he was copying. Let's take a quick break. We've put a lot of effort into this video, so if you find it informative, please remember to subscribe and like. Your support allows us to create more content for you. The captain was taxiing much slower than he should have because of the heavy rainfall. The runway was wet and the wind was blowing full force. If they had taxied faster, the wind could have blown the giant Boeing 747 off the runway. The wind was increasing with each passing minute and visibility was dropping rapidly. The third pilot in the back said that the wind was 29 knots and approaching 30 knots. They were almost at their limit. The captain pilot replied okay. The tower officer connected to the pilots and told them that they were clear to take off because there was no other traffic on the runway except them due to the weather conditions. So they were cleared to take off under the pilot's responsibility before they even reached the runway. Visibility at the airport was below 500 meters. The wind was blowing so hard that the captain and co-pilot were reading different indications on their instruments. They aligned the giant double-decker jet at the beginning of the runway. This point is very critical. The tower said they were cleared to take off from runway 05 left. The pilots connected to the frequency and said they were cleared to take off from runway 05 left. But the pilots made a big mistake and entered runway 05 right instead of runway 05 left. To understand the situation better, let's talk more clearly about the airport and the runways. The pilots did not realize which runway they were entering due to low visibility during the taxi phase. They should have taxied to the 05 left runway in the north, but they entered and aligned on the 05 right runway with great carelessness. The controller could not see that the pilots were entering the wrong runway due to low visibility. The captain did not realize the situation when entering the runway. They were focused on slow taxiing and wind conditions so that the plane would not run off the runway. All 3 pilots were completely unaware that they had entered the wrong runway. They lined up on runway 05 right, with 179 passengers on board. They completed their final preparations. Simply, the system was indicating that the pilots were on the wrong runway, but the pilots were focused on the weather and had lost situational awareness. After the 05 right runway was in their sights, the captain said that the runway was visible. He said that nothing was preventing them from taking off, and that even though the weather conditions were bad, he had the situation under control. He gave power to the 4 engines of the giant jet. They started to accelerate on the runway. They reached V1 speed. This speed meant that it was now forbidden to cancel the takeoff run. As they continued to run for takeoff, suddenly the captain shouted that there was something in front of us. Construction vehicles suddenly appeared in front of the massive jet, the bulldozer excavator and concrete barriers in the middle of the runway. The construction of the runway they had entered incorrectly had not yet been completed. The pilots were at a loss, but it was too late for the jet, which was now traveling at 275 km/h. The massive jet with flight number 006 crashed into construction vehicles and concrete barriers with 179 people on board. The Boeing 747 broke into 3 pieces and the fuel in the wings suddenly caught fire. The controller, who was waiting for the plane to take off, was suddenly confronted with a huge ball of red flames. Parts of the plane were blown off the runway by the skidding immediately after impact. The images on the screen show the severity of the accident. Search and rescue teams and ambulances were immediately dispatched to the scene. More than 400 teams rushed to the scene immediately after the accident. Unfortunately, 81 of the 179 people died at the scene. 2 people died in the hospital where they were taken. 96 people survived, including 3 pilots. The accident was the first fatal accident involving Singapore Airlines and a Boeing 747-400. When the crash investigation teams arrived, it didn't take them long to realize why the accident happened. The pilots had confused the runways and entered the 05 right, which was under construction. So how did the experienced pilots make such a mistake? Before taking off, pilots are briefed on the airport ground chart for the runway they will take off from. This way they can check which runways are active, where in the airport there are restrictions, and which taxiways they will use before taking off. But the experienced crew made a big mistake. They should have checked the chart. They only focused on the weather, and they wanted to take off as soon as possible due to bad weather conditions. As a result, they entered the wrong runway and did not realize it. In addition, the captain pilot's decision to taxi slowly caused the taxi times to be extended and their situational awareness to be lost. The pilots were also not aware of the runway numbers at the beginning of the runway. After the accident, the runway lighting and signs were renewed to prevent such accidents. The Boeing 747 belonging to Singapore Airlines was painted in special colors for the new business class section. For a long time, Singapore Airlines decided not to repaint any of its aircraft in color again. In memory of the 83 people who lost their lives in the Singapore Airlines Flight 6 tragedy,